All right, next up, we have Jesse Abrams. Jesse is a research associate with the Ecosystem Workforce Program at the University of Oregon. His research centers on community-based natural resource management, rural development, and environmental policy and governance.
Thanks. All right, sounds good, perfect. All right, thanks so much. Happy to be here. What I want to talk about today, I think, has some really nice overlaps with what we've already heard and what we're likely to hear later on as this conference proceeds. A lot of folks have talked about this notion of collaboration. What I want to do is to kind of start at collaboration and move forward and talk about what's happening beyond collaborative decision-making that kind of builds on some of those successes. And so others here will certainly talk about the ecological issues, the ecological crisis that's led us to the situation where we need to do such large landscape-scale forest restoration. I want to talk about a couple of other crises that are also quite important here. The first one really having to do with this notion of a crisis of legitimacy that started to affect the forestry world probably in the 1960s or 70s and came to a head in the late 80s, early 90s. And what I mean here is this is the same concept that many folks talk about when they say, when they talk about the term of social license, the idea of sort of a general public trust in the forestry world and in the forestry agencies to manage on behalf of a greater public good. That sort of public trust was lost about 30 years ago. And so since that time, the world of collaboration has, in a sense, stepped up to help rebuild that legitimacy from the ground up. But there's been another crisis as well, which is the crisis in capacity. And so Susan Charnley talked about that in her talk earlier today. And so we talk about this notion of a crisis of legitimacy. There's a lot of ways we can think about it. Here's just one example, this being the number of court cases challenging Forest Service NEPA between 1970 and 2001. And so, as I mentioned, there's this idea that this national level legitimacy collapsed at some point, but it's been rebuilt sort of one place at a time through these collaborative processes. However, and I should say that this collaboration, part of the reason it's been successful, it's not just that people have agreed in concept, but it's also that they've been able to see the benefits of this in practice. And so particularly for rural communities, communities that were traditionally dependent upon the economic activity associated with federal lands, for them the benefits often come in economic form. So if they're seeing a restoration economy being built from these practices, that's where their motivation to continue supporting these collaborative processes are going to come from. And this just shows an example of sort of the scope of these sort of collaborative efforts across my part of the world, the Pacific Northwest. And you can see, we're talking some really large landscapes here that are essentially being governed through these collaborative processes. At the same time, there's a second crisis that I think is really important to highlight, which is this crisis in capacity. And so this shows some data from my part of the world, from the Pacific Northwest primarily, showing changes in Forest Service staffing between 1973 and 2012. And so in Region 6, we're down 37% in terms of the number of FTEs since 1973, and we're actually down more than half since the height of the Forest Service hiring in 1980. At a national level, it's not quite that bad, but even at a national level, if you compare 1980 with 2012, you're looking at a difference of about a third. So it's a pretty significant drop in agency capacity. And it's not just the numbers, it's not just the number of FTEs. I think we all know this story, that more and more of the Forest Service FTEs are not going towards what we used to think of as those core forest management objectives or roles. They're actually going more and more towards fire and fire suppression, right? And so even just between 1998 and 2015, you can see the difference here. This comes from a 2015 Forest Service report. And I think we're all pretty familiar with this story. That according to the agency itself, between a 24% and a 64% decline in some of those core forest management activities, the vegetation management, monitoring, roads, and planning. And so there's this question of, well, how do we do the sort of restoration we're talking about if we're looking at an agency that's both losing a number of FTEs as well as having to shift more and more of that towards immediate fire response duties? And so I think part of the answer, and I think we've heard this from other folks today, is that the agency is really moving, it's sort of changing its governance model. And I think for most of the 20th century, it was kind of squarely in this part of the graph here. So this was what's called the dominant federal approach, the idea that the federal government takes care of essentially every part of the process with the exception of actually cutting the trees, which is contracted out to the private sector. And I think since the 90s, we've really seen kind of a movement down towards something more like this network governance approach, where the agency is increasingly dependent upon its partnerships and upon these relationships with non-agency and in many cases non-federal or non-governmental entities in order to achieve its objectives. And so what I want to talk about here is what some of those models look like, and I'm primarily going to focus on the successes, but I also, given the theme of this conference as what's working and what's not, I also want to raise some critical questions about whether these models are really sufficient and where we might be headed. So what I'm going to do is give examples from a few different projects that we've had going on at my institute, the Institute for Sustainable Environment, and sort of kind of skip across a few of these to provide kind of a 30,000-foot view of where we might be going. So the first project I want to talk about is one where we looked at community-based organizations. And so if I think for a lot of folks, when you look at the sorts of organizations we call community-based organizations, your first thought might be, oh, it's a collaborative group. And I can see why there might be some confusion, because these are organizations that often do lead collaborative processes or engage in collaborative processes, but they actually go far beyond that. And so some of the organizations you may be familiar with would be Our Resources in Northeast Oregon, the Watershed Research and Training Center in Northern California, Salmon Valley Stewards in Idaho. And so the way we define these for the purpose of our project, these are registered nonprofit organizations, so they're not just sort of informal networks. They're based in rural communities, and they have a mission, and they actually spend their budget on both resource stewardship and rural economic development. And the idea here is that these are the organizations that are really creating that coalescence between these large-scale sort of national interests in forest management, forest restoration, and these local benefits, the jobs and the opportunity to participate in this restoration economy that's going to keep these rural communities engaged. And so, we talk about them as being sort of the key link in creating this restoration economy. According to our research, there's somewhere around 100 of these in the West, including Alaska. But honestly, it's a little hard to tell for sure, because it's a bit of a squishy definition, and there's no sort of master list of CBOs. And so what I want to do is to talk about what it means to have a CBO involved in sort of helping to facilitate these processes. I'm just going to give an example from the Watershed Research and Training Center, which is in Northern California around Hayfork in Trinity County. And so the Watershed Research and Training Center started kind of right after the Northwest Forest Plan with this idea of, okay, we need to build this new economy around restoration. How are we going to do that? And so they started out with a lot of what you might think of as kind of traditional civil society roles. So facilitating those collaborative processes, getting grants, engaging that rural economic development, the sorts of things we sort of assumed that rural NGOs would do in this situation. What's interesting here is that they went really beyond that notion of just collaboration, beyond that notion of just rural economic development, to actually taking on roles that we normally associate with the private sector and even with the public sector, with the federal government. And so some of those private sector roles, they were actually investing in their own wood processing infrastructure, so they're innovating new solutions to how do we economically deal with this new type of timber, this small diameter timber. They're actually hiring out their own workforces on contract as a field crew for the local Forest Service units, and actually even getting their own contracts, working under contracts to conduct those forest management activities. Again, those things you would assume the private sector would do, but because the private sector essentially pulled out of this area after the Northwest Forest Plan, there was no one left to step up to take on these roles. And interestingly, they went beyond just the private sector to actually taking on public sector roles. So these are things that previously we would have imagined only the Forest Service would probably do these things, leading ID teams, conducting parts of the NEPA analysis, actually acquiring funding to implement projects on those federal lands, administering contracts, conducting monitoring, and actually even in some cases leading prescribed fire crews on these both federal and non-federal, and in some cases cross-boundary projects. So interestingly, we see this as one of those ways in which that missing capacity, that declining capacity is being filled in a way that's kind of locally legitimate, socially legitimate, and helping to create that restoration economy. And so this is sort of an interesting quote from one of the people that we talked to when we were doing our case study of the Watershed Center, a Forest Service representative who said, "I've always called them the little Forest Service because they're a replica of us but way tiered down," really pointing to that idea that this is an organization that's really stepped into that breach where the agency lost so much capacity and this NGO kind of stepped in to help fill it. And so that's just one example. So what about CBOs more broadly across the West? Well, we did a survey a couple of years ago, again, this is preliminary because it's not a population that's well defined, but of the 54 or so CBOs that we were able to contact, over 70% of them said that they do conduct some sort of analysis that was traditionally done by those government agencies. So they're helping to refill that gap in capacity. And they said overall, on average, about 57% of their activity is concentrated on public lands. So these really are organizations that are stepping into that gap. However, and this is where I start to move into sort of the critical question component, these are generally very small organizations. On average, they have 0 to 2 full-time staff and less than $500,000 annual budgets. And so I think it raises some questions about really what the capacity is of these organizations to fill such a massive gap in staffing and capacity in the Forest Service. Beyond this, the geography of CBOs is not even across space. What I mean by that is we can look at places like the Watershed Center, like Will Our Resources, these sort of shining stars of the CBO world, who are really helping to sort of kind of innovate and kind of raise the bar nationwide. But not every community in the West has a Watershed Center or or Will Our Resources. And so, for example, when we looked state by state, Oregon had over 20 identified CBOs that we could find, whereas places like Utah and Nevada had less than 2. And so it does raise some critical questions, such as, what do we do about those places that don't have this sort of capacity? How do we transfer those successful models from places like Northern California and Northeast Oregon? And if we do build up this local capacity, where will the funding come from? Where's the charitable funding, or where's the public funding that's going to help support this sort of massive boost in capacity at the local level? So moving on, I'm going to talk about another project that I think relates to this. So this comes out of some research we've done in places that have been hit really hard by the mountain pine beetle. And so this is an issue I think most folks in the room are familiar with, a continental scale disturbance event. At one point, 9 million acres affected in 1 year alone across the West. So really a massive, massive disturbance event. And so what we were trying to find out in this case was what happens in the aftermath? What are these communities doing when they've seen such a massive disturbance event in their backyard? Are they reorganizing? Are they helping to change policy? Are they helping to change management in some way? What's the sort of governance outcome of this kind of disturbance? And so we did these case studies across the West. And one of the things that we found out is that there was often some sort of a short-term response network that came into play in the wake of the disturbance. And so a couple of these examples that folks may be familiar with, the Colorado Bark Beetle Coalition in Colorado that I'll talk about in a moment, the Mountain Pine Beetle Working Group in the Black Hills of South Dakota. In some other geographies, we had existing groups, existing networks that sort of took on these beetle response roles that were kind of very parallel to this. And I would say they've been very successful in what they've done. So the Colorado Bark Beetle Coalition brought in over $50 million in primarily federal funds to Colorado to deal with some of the sort of immediate needs in the wake of this bark beetle outbreak. And so in general, what we're seeing these organizations do is actually quite similar to what we saw the CBOs doing. So planning in coordination with the agencies, actually getting funding to aid in implementation, participating in policy processes at the local level, state level, federal level, and in some cases actually investing either directly or indirectly in maintaining a wood processing infrastructure that could help to support these sorts of restoration economy that would be needed to sustain a program of work. And so you can see these are very similar to what we saw the CBOs doing, right? The difference here being that, as the name implies, these short-term response groups were kind of by nature short-term, and so was their funding. So what we're often seeing is that there'd be kind of a pulse of funding right after some major disturbance event, and after a few years, the crisis went away, the funding went away, and in some cases, even the participation in these networks started to decline. And so the Colorado Bark Beetle Coalition, for example, they made a conscious effort to try to transition from a sort of a short-term response to more of a long-term, forward-looking, sort of forest resilience type organization. And not only did their membership drop off sharply, but the funding did as well. And so I think, again, this raises some questions here. How do we move past this short-term reactive planning? And how do we change some of these institutions that drive these sorts of disturbance events in the first place? You know, we looked at, in our case studies, we tried to look for evidence of, did something change beyond sort of the local level or the state level in the wake of these massive mountain pine beetle outbreaks? And the answer is, generally speaking, no. We saw a few very small changes at the federal level, but for the most part, the changes we saw were county or state, but really nothing that might affect sort of the overall governance of these systems. So now I want to move on to a third and sort of final example, which we've already heard a little bit about today, which has to do with states and local governments, and I'll talk about NGOs in a moment here, as being a sort of an alternative source for refilling some of this missing capacity in the agencies. And these are all, I think, examples that we'll be familiar with. So the Good Neighbor Authority allowing states to play a more active role in managing federal lands. We talked, I think Dick just talked about the Farm Bill, CE, emergency designations, kind of providing an additional route for state authority on federal lands. I think a couple of people mentioned the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Fund, $10 million bond measure that's going to help restore forests in Flagstaff's municipal watershed. And then in my state, in Oregon, we have the Federal Forest Health Program, or I think recently renamed Federal Forest Restoration Program, that's committed to a little under $8 million between 2013 and 2017 for these sorts of things. Collaborative capacity, so helping to build that collaborative capacity to build agreement on restoration, technical assistance to collaborative groups, and actually, more than anything else, they're actually spending money on project implementation. So going back to this idea of they're sort of filling in for the sorts of things we would have imagined the Forest Service having a monopoly on not too long ago. And this is just an example of what some of these projects might look like. So nothing super surprising here, except that it's the fact that it's the state taking these on instead of the federal agency, the Forest Service. So unit layout, stand exams, boundary surveying, road surveys, endangered species surveys, heritage surveys. These are all the sorts of things that the state is starting to actually put their own money into paying for, under the idea that by kind of meeting these critical capacity needs, they'll help to accelerate restoration, get these projects done, and provide those economic benefits to rural communities. And so that's sort of the idea, and I think we're starting to see this more and more across the West. Looking at this notion of NGOs, this is, in my mind, I couldn't pick a better example of what sort of restoration looks like these days than this graphic, which I did not create myself. This comes from some folks on the Deschutes National Forest, from the Indian Ford Creek Restoration Project. And so you can see here, the idea behind this project is it's not just the agency doing it solo anymore. They've got a stewardship agreement with the Mule Deer Foundation. They've got both Mule Deer and Trout Unlimited contributing in-kind and monetary contributions. They've got a challenge cost share component, and then they've got the Audubon Society engaging in monitoring. And so this is, I think, another sort of example, another model of what restoration is looking like these days with these sort of new alternative forms of governance. And so I think this is really interesting, and this particular project also did a really nice job of engaging the local community, and I think could be a nice model of sort of what restoration might look like going forward. However, I do want to raise some critical questions as well, and so here looking, this again goes back to the Pacific Northwest. Here's some data from fiscal year 14 to 16 on terrestrial habitat enhancement projects in Region 6. And so what we saw is about $156 million invested, which is great. Partner contributions range from a little over 10 million to maybe 2 or 3 million in each of those years, whereas the Forest Service contribution about from 30 to maybe 80 million. So if you do the math, it turns out the partner contributions maybe somewhere around 10%. If we look at collaborative forest landscape restoration projects, which I think Tony Cheng's going to talk about in a moment here, we see a similar pattern here. So of the 123 million invested in the Pacific Northwest over the last several years, the partner match comes out to about 13 million, which is, again, somewhere right around that 10% mark. And some of that, not all of that partner match is itself federal. So these aren't all NGOs and states and things. And so I guess, while I want to point out that this is still hugely beneficial and it is really helping to create some capacity that wasn't there before, I think we do need to ask some critical questions. Is this really enough? When we're talking about a place that's lost half of its capacity since 1980, is a 10% boost from NGOs and states going to make up that difference? And if it does, if it does really start to fill in that gap, will those paying the piper start calling the tune? I think this is an important question to raise because of the fact that that this notion of legitimacy is still in some ways fragile. And so if we start having the states or large NGOs sort of setting the agenda, are we going to start losing the voice of those local communities that have really invested in this notion of local benefits from restoration? And so how do we do that? How do we ensure that these local communities don't lose their voice in this process? So I have a few conclusions here. I think I've got a few minutes left. And so what I want to say, obviously I'm raising some critical questions here. My point isn't to sort of overly criticize these new governance models. I actually think they're, for the most part, working really well. They're showing a lot of promise. There's others we could have talked about in terms of some of these ecosystem payments, ecosystem service payments and things that I think raise similar questions. And I would say that they're working, and yet the agencies still need funding, right? I just think there's no getting around the fact that without with an agency that doesn't have the capacity, I think as Susan said, there's going to be some real roadblocks to getting restoration done. And so I wanted to give an example from an interview I did up in the Colville National Forest in Washington. And this person said there's this long time period where the whole idea was, let's do more with less and let's get more efficiencies. And he says, I think we've just reached this point where we're basically as efficient as we can be. We don't need any more tools in the toolbox, any more policy or farm bills. We've got all the tools. We can't even use them because we just need more people. And so this is an example of a forest that is really getting a lot done. It's getting a lot of restoration done. It's producing timber. It's producing economic activity for the local community. So this isn't the kind of place that's just sort of bogged down in endless bureaucratic processes. But I think what they're saying here is these tools are great and we're using them and we're using them well. But at some point we need to have the staff capacity to actually be able to move forward. A second conclusion for me that this brings up is that these new governance mechanisms are working, and yet we still need to think about building capacity in rural communities. There's still a lot of rural communities that they just don't have the sort of capacity that's going to allow them to really build that restoration economy, to allow them to gain those benefits from restoration, and therefore continue to support this notion of restoration as a paradigm on public lands. And so, as I think I mentioned earlier, there are many places that seem to be kind of the shining stars, but that may not be the case throughout the West as a whole. And then finally, I would say we need to ensure that rural communities continue to have a voice moving forward. I think a lot of these new funding mechanisms and these new governance mechanisms are very exciting and really show a lot of promise. But rural communities, for the most part, are not going to be the ones stepping up with millions of dollars to contribute to these processes. And given that, we need to ask the question how they're going to maintain a seat at the table when they may not have the money to help fill in for these gaps. So that's all I have. I wanted to leave my email address up here and invite folks to contact me. You know, we have publications associated with all these projects that I mentioned, and I'd be happy to share those with you. So thanks for your time, and happy to take any questions now.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah.
I heard you talking a lot about rural communities and benefits for rural communities, which is all well and good, but I didn't hear you talking much about predominantly federal lands and the federal benefit, and that these are lands of all the people. So it's an age-old argument, but from the tone of your discussion, it sounded like it was leaning heavily towards benefits to rural communities and perhaps funding from federal government without some sort of equality or equal equity and benefits for the American people at large.
Totally fair question. I guess my answer to that is, you know, when we look at the sorts of processes that are happening across the West, I think there's room at the table for all sorts of voices. And so when we look at the sorts of people that are in these collaborative processes, that are in these governance networks, they're not purely rural voices, right? I mean, they're folks from national organizations, national conservation organizations. There's often people from national timber industry organizations, as well as regional. So all those people have a seat at the table and a voice. And I think what we're seeing with a lot of these new governance mechanisms is kind of a shift towards looking at, in many ways, that what benefits does it provide towards the large segments of the population. So an example of that would be these ecosystem service payments, where you've got a municipal watershed, you've got a city like, let's say, Denver or Santa Fe, where you're looking at using those sort of utility payments as a way of funding restoration projects. And those are great. I'm not criticizing those in any way. My point is that urban areas often will have economic and political power to contribute to these processes that rural areas just don't. And my concern is that if you lose the engagement, if you lose the buy-in from rural communities, you're going to lose the whole program of work. Because at the end of the day, most of these projects are taking place in rural areas. Not all of them, but most of them are. And I think one lesson from sort of conservation, social science worldwide is, if local people don't believe in what you're doing, if they don't agree with what's going on in their own backyard, they're not going to support it, and they're going to find ways to shut that down. And so I think even from a purely pragmatic perspective, even if you don't particularly care about rural communities, and I'm not accusing you of that, I'm just saying in theory, you still want to make sure that local people feel that they are getting a benefit out of the deal, because if not, I think the whole program of work is at risk. Yeah.
So, following up on that, I was wondering, so there's 100 CDOs or so in the West. Are those organically growing out of places like Hayfork or Elgin or someplace, or are they people who grew up in Marin County or Clackamas County and fell in love with some place in the West and decided they wanted to do something with their college education? Because that really affects the legitimacy within the community and the sustainability.
Right. That's a fantastic point, Mark. I appreciate you bringing that up. And in fact, we actually have a piece that came out earlier this year specifically on that point around how do you build local legitimacy in these community-based organizations when in many cases they're not. In some cases they are staffed by people from the local community. In many cases they're not. Excuse me. And so again, I think the answer comes back less to a question of is this person, a local, and the question comes back to is this person working in the local interest? Do they understand us? Are they helping us to gain access to things we may not have access to before? I think in many cases, and I certainly don't want to speak for sort of rural communities as a whole, I haven't noticed that people in these areas are particularly threatened by the idea of someone from the outside coming in to work in their community if they feel that they're going to take the time to understand them and help them connect with those outside resources. I think often the idea of someone with a network that's not local, someone who has connections to sort of urban funding networks, to the Forest Service, to federal agencies, is seen as a good thing. And so I think as long as those people are seen as acting in the local interest, there's not necessarily a huge tension there. So, but it's a great question. Yeah.
So since collaboration is usually put forward kind of like the next step, and you've done a lot of like shining stars in community-based organizations. How do you perceive there being fatigue with collaboration sometimes, especially when you have as one of the partners or players like someone like the Forest Service is maybe understaffed. They're asked to devote their time to these different collaborations. If you do see that fatigue, how do you see any way forward?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic question. And so this notion of collaboration fatigue, process fatigue is a real thing, and I think we've seen it all over the West. My answer to that, and maybe just sort of repeating the same idea, but I think if we ask the Forest Service to go it alone and to kind of do everything themselves, then we're setting ourselves up for trouble. I think where we get the most bang for our buck and where we get the most benefit is when we have these intermediary organizations taking on some of that heavy lifting. I think, kind of going back to Dick's point, the Forest Service in many ways is still the same agency it was 100 years ago. I mean, there's lots of ways in which it's changed, but there are a lot of needs right now that really aren't accommodated well by the current structure of the Forest Service, and maybe for the time being they shouldn't be. I mean, right now we're still kind of in a period of experimentation, and I think that seeing what NGOs can do, what these community-based organizations can do, what organizations like National Forest Foundation can do, they're really kind of experimenting and innovating, and in many ways, I think they are carrying the heavy weight of some of these collaborative processes. And so I think the more we can allow that innovation to continue, the less of that burden gets placed on the back of the Forest Service. Yeah, Dick.
Do you have any mechanisms to share lessons learned across people who may not? How do you get that to people that don't understand that that's available?
So specifically, what's available?
That lessons learned from the high performance to places that may not have that.
Right. No, it's a great question. And actually, there was a project a few years ago called the Dry Forest Investment Zone, which specifically had the idea of helping to take what they call these sort of anchor communities like Hayfork and Wallowa County and have them actually kind of help build capacity in other communities. And I think it's worked to some extent. I mean, there's been, I think, a growth in the capacity of some of these other organizations, particularly in the Northwest. We've seen the Blue Mountain Forest Partners really kind of take off in recent years. But I think there's a larger question of how do you institutionalize this across the West as a whole. So I think we have had some success in Eastern Oregon, but that's just one small piece of the picture. So, yeah, Tony.
I want to go back to your original sort of premise of your presentation, which is about governance,
Right.
Beyond collaboration. And all the data and things that you presented suggest that you say that the decline capacity on the federal government side disturbances that are overwhelming the capacity of all the system. And then you still have like things like Multiple Use Act and all these expectations that are sort of grounded in these high desires for what we as society think we want from public land. But yet there's, everything you presented tells me that that space is no longer being occupied. So do we, what's sort of out there from a social ecological systems?
Right.
view from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think about that a lot. And I mean, and I actually cut this out of an earlier draft of this presentation. One of the things that's most striking to me about the evolution of the Forest Service as an agency is how much it's changed in the last 30 years with so little federal policy change, right? I mean, when you think about the actual policies that have been passed, congressional policies that have been passed that have created new authorities or whatever for the Forest Service, there have been some, the Healthy Forest Act and Collaborative Forest Restoration Program, et cetera. But these are sort of, in some ways, smaller programmatic bills. We haven't had kind of a large-scale, visionary, sort of what's our mandate, what's our mission in the world, congressional bill since 1976 and since the National Forest Management Act, right? And so that's what's striking to me is how much the agency has evolved without really having a new mandate from Congress. So to me, that would at least be potentially part of the answer. I mean, I'm not here to advocate for new policies, but just to say that not only are we running a 100-year-old agency, but we're running essentially on an almost 50-year-old, 45, 50-year-old mandate that really isn't tracking the way the agency has evolved over time. And so I think at least some of these issues we're talking about could potentially be addressed with some direction from Congress. Because in a sense, the agency has had to sort of cobble these new things together kind of one piece at a time. And I totally agree with Dick's point that we're asking an agency with a 100-year-old business model to take on these 21st century challenges. So, yeah, Dick, go ahead.
What do you think the role of us not being funded forced us to change? Because we got all the money in the world, that damn well sure we wouldn't change.
Yeah, no, I actually had this exact conversation with Diane this morning that I absolutely think that one of the things that's led to this innovation is just desperation, right? Right? And maybe that's, they say necessity is the mother of invention, and I think that's the case with the Forest Service. So, again, we're in a period of change. This is a huge period of change right now. We're certainly not done with it. But I think it's interesting to see the sort of experimentation that's happening, not just within the agency, but really without as well. That's probably about as much time as I have. So,
Yeah.
all right.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks.